That's all a last phone call becomes, once the room goes quiet and the story turns into evidence. A handful of numbers pressed into a rotary dial. A line that rings. A pause. A voice on the other end that doesn't yet understand what it's being pulled into. And on July 20, 1973, in Hong Kong, Bruce Lee's final hours can be traced not by punches or camera reels, but by calls that were ordinary at the time, then became haunted afterward. The strange part is, the last phone call isn't one call. It's a sequence. A chain of small, human check-ins that slowly turns into panic, then turns into history. This is that story. Bruce Lee was 32 years old, and he was still building. That morning, according to a detailed reconstruction, he typed a letter to his American attorney, Adrian Marshall, describing deals on the table: big ones, forward-looking ones, the kind you only write when you assume you'll be alive to sign contracts months later. And that is the first contradiction of July 20th. A man who will not see the end of the day begins it like an architect. He leaves his mansion in Kowloon Tong and heads into the machinery of film and money. Later accounts suggest he met that day with George Lazenby at Golden Harvest to talk about bringing him into Game of Death, with Andre Morgan present because he could bridge the language gap. It was business, future, momentum. But that wasn't the part people obsess over. The obsession begins with an apartment. According to the same reconstruction, Bruce drove to Betty Ting Pei's second-floor apartment at 67 Beacon Hill Road around 1 p.m. The details are specific enough to feel like a police report: parquet flooring, wooden walls, thick curtains. Hours passed there, mostly out of sight. And once a story goes out of sight, the public starts inventing light. That's when rumor begins sharpening its knives. In this case, the rumors came later, but the conditions were already forming: secrecy, celebrity, and a city that could not tolerate an ordinary ending for an extraordinary man. Raymond Chow enters this day like a man trying to keep a schedule from collapsing. In the reconstruction, Chow arrived at Betty's apartment around 6 p.m. It was brutally hot. One retelling specifies about 90 degrees Fahrenheit and heavy humidity, the kind that makes even sitting still feel like work. Chow later recalled that Bruce wasn't feeling well, that they drank water, and that Bruce acted out scenes with his body as he talked, jumping up, performing, burning energy even while his body was asking for less. Then comes the headache. The small word with the massive shadow. Near 7:30 p.m., Bruce complained of pain. Plans were in motion: pick up Lazenby, go to dinner, formalize decisions. But the pain grew. In that retelling, Betty gave Bruce an Equagesic pill, a common prescription pain medication, and Bruce went to lie down. Chow left around 7:45 p.m. to pick up Lazenby. This is where the phone calls start to matter. Because the calls begin as routine. They are not yet fear. They are logistics. They are the normal "where are you" that fills the gaps of a busy evening. At the bar, with Lazenby waiting, Chow called Betty's apartment around 8:15 p.m. by that reconstruction. She said Bruce was still asleep. Chow and Lazenby ate without them. Think about that moment. In a city full of noise, the most famous man in Hong Kong is lying in a bedroom behind a closed door, and the world still thinks it's just a nap. What happened next didn't announce itself with violence. It arrived as a longer silence than expected. Around 9:30 p.m., after dinner, Chow called again. Betty said Bruce was still asleep, but she would try to wake him. The language of that moment is almost unbearable in hindsight: try to wake him, because it suggests that up until then, she had not truly tried. She had protected his rest the way people do when they assume rest is safe. But the bedroom was different now. In the reconstruction, Betty opened the door slowly, crept in, knelt beside him, whispered his name. Nothing. She pushed his shoulder, spoke louder. Nothing. Then panic rose and she shook him and shouted. Nothing. And now the phone call becomes something else. Not a check-in. An alarm. Betty called Chow back hysterical. This is the call that matters, because it is the moment the evening's social mask breaks. Chow told her to calm down. He would drive over immediately. And something else happened inside him at the same time: memory. He flashed back to May 10, 1973, when Bruce had nearly died of cerebral edema. That earlier incident is a credibility anchor in later accounts because it proves the body had thrown a warning before, and now the calls multiply. Chow tried to reach Dr. Langford, the doctor who had saved Bruce's life in May. But the line was busy. No cell phones. No quick texts. Just the old world, where a busy signal could become a wall you cannot climb. Chow raced across town, stopping at pay phones, redialing, hearing the same tone again and again. This is the confrontation in the story. Not Bruce versus a rival. Chow versus time. A man trying to push through an ordinary obstacle, busy line, city traffic, distance, while the stakes quietly become irreversible. According to the reconstruction, when Chow arrived, Bruce was undressed, lying flat on a mattress on the floor. Betty was crumpled next to him, calling his name until her voice went hoarse. Bruce did not respond. Chow realized he was too late. And here the story becomes morally radioactive. Because the moment you understand someone is dead, you are no longer only a human being in a room. You are a potential suspect in the public imagination. You are a witness. A caretaker. A survivor. A person whose next decision will be interpreted forever. The reconstruction describes Chow seeing the danger, the most famous man in Hong Kong dead in his mistress's bed, with only them as witnesses. It suggests Chow redressed Bruce's shirt, trousers, boots, while weighing options, because a death in that apartment would create a scandal that could swallow everyone involved. Whether you interpret that as protection or manipulation, it adds a new layer to the last phone call. Because now phone calls are no longer about help. They are about controlling the story. A doctor was called Dr. Eugene Chu Po Hui, described as Betty's concierge physician. He arrived and attempted to revive Bruce for about 10 minutes without success in that reconstruction. At this point, according to later medical summaries, the official record would emphasize cerebral edema, with debate about cause continuing for decades. One later academic paper even proposes a different physiological hypothesis while explicitly stating it relies on publicly available information it cannot verify. That tension between official conclusion and ongoing uncertainty keeps the story open like a wound. Then comes another call. The call to Linda. Before the ambulance arrived, Chow called Bruce's wife and told her to go to Queen Elizabeth Hospital right away, that Bruce was on his way there, something like last time. That phrase is chilling because it is both understatement and a code. It is an attempt to keep panic contained while moving people into position. The ambulance arrived around 10:30 p.m. in that account. Paramedics found a patient without a pulse, not breathing, and began treatment because that is what protocol demands even when hope is gone. They transported him to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and Linda arrived before the ambulance, only to be told at the desk, "Somebody must be joking, we don't know anything about it." Then she saw the gurney. That's another confrontation. Linda versus denial. Because when you are not ready to lose someone, the mind fights reality like it's a physical opponent. The reconstruction describes doctors trying to revive him, shocking, injecting, moving fast, while Linda noticed the EKG flatline. The moment the theater of rescue ends and truth remains. A little after 11:30 p.m., phones across Hong Kong began ringing with the news: Bruce Lee was dead. The cause was unknown to the public. And from that point forward, the phone stopped being an object of connection. It became an instrument of rumor. Calls to reporters. Calls to police. Calls to studios. Calls to friends. Calls to enemies who suddenly remembered they had always known something. And when the press gathered, early rumors spiraled out: fight, attack, beatings, anything that sounded more fitting than an ordinary medical collapse. In the reconstruction, one reporter even called Charles Lowe with a claim that Bruce died in a fight, and Lowe dismissed it as madness before calling Bruce's residence, where young Brandon answered. This is where the last phone call becomes symbolic. Because Bruce Lee's life was about control, distance, timing, awareness, precision. Yet the final hours show a different kind of control, the one people attempt when they can't control death. Control the narrative. Control the location. Control what the public believes. The reconstruction describes Golden Harvest issuing a statement that Bruce collapsed at home in his garden with Linda, a picturesque image meant to protect reputation, until an intrepid reporter traced ambulance logs and exposed the Beacon Hill Road pickup from there. the city's imagination ignited. Tabloids swarmed. Speculation became violent. Fake bombs appeared with messages about revenge, according to that narrative. An inquest struggled because even with autopsy findings, experts couldn't agree on why he died. Cerebral edema was identified, but the cause remained contested, and fans refused to accept the simplest options, and that is the true legacy of the last phone call. Not the exact words, because the exact words are not preserved like scripture. The legacy is the chain reaction. A routine call becomes concern. Concern becomes panic. Panic becomes a scramble for help. Help becomes a public spectacle. And the spectacle becomes an argument that never ends. But if you step back and listen closely, the last phone call is also a portrait of the world Bruce Lee lived in. A world without instant communication. A world where a busy signal could block a doctor. A world where a payphone at a stoplight could be the only hope of reaching help in time. A world where the difference between rescue and tragedy might be measured in how quickly someone found a working line. And it's also a portrait of the price of legend. Because when an ordinary person dies, their last phone calls remain private. When Bruce Lee died, every ring became public property. Every unanswered call became suspicious. Every delay became a possible crime. Even the act of trying to protect his image became, ironically, the very fuel that destroyed trust. So what do we do with this story now, decades later? We don't treat it like a magic trick. We treat it like a room full of humans, under pressure, trying to react to an event they were not built to handle. We acknowledge the documented anchors, the date, the location, the phone calls described in major retellings, the ambulance, the hospital, the medical finding of cerebral edema, and the fact that the why remains debated in mainstream and academic discussion, and we hold the myth and the realism in the same hand. Because if you lean too far into myth, you turn grief into entertainment. If you lean too far into clinical realism, you miss why the world still can't let this go. The last phone call of Bruce Lee isn't famous because it's dramatic. It's famous because it's ordinary. A call asking where someone is. A call asking if he's awake. A call that turns into, I can't wake him. A call that makes a man run out into the night, searching for a doctor behind a busy line. A call that reaches a wife with a sentence that tries to sound calm and fails. And then the final calls out into the city when the news breaks and everyone wants their own version of the truth. Bruce Lee spent his life teaching people to intercept, to respond, to adapt in the smallest fraction of time. But no philosophy can intercept a busy signal. No discipline can force an unconscious body to answer. No fame can stop the clock from moving forward. That's why this story ends quietly, even if the world around it grew loud. Because at the center of all the calls, there is still only a room. A rotary phone. A receiver lifted and pressed to an ear. And somewhere, on the other end of the line, a person hearing fear in a voice and realizing too late that they are about to become part of history. It's easy to imagine a last phone call as a final message, a perfect closing line, a whisper meant for a film. Real life doesn't do that. Real life leaves you with unanswered rings. With sentences cut short. With I'll come later. With he's sleeping. With try again. With hurry. And then, after it's over, the line goes dead. Not dramatically. Just silent. And that silence is what remains, even now. Not a solved mystery. A human moment preserved in fragments, echoing through decades, until the last phone call stops being about what was said. And becomes about what was lost. That is the truth you find at the end of the line.